All right. Can you guys all see my screen? All right, great. All right, let me just view present. Great. All right. So as you guys know, this is our MD PhD panel. So hopefully you're at the right place. We're collaborating with we're at MEDX National, and we're collaborating with IPMS, International Hypermass Society UCLA, and we're featuring three amazing panelists from different doctors today. So yeah, let's get started. So our timeline from 7:05 to 7:10, we'll have a quick speaker introduction, and from 7:10 to 7:40, we will have our questions Q&A. Sorry, oops. For our questions Q&A, and our speakers will talk about their own experiences, and we'll have a couple of different themes. And from 7:40 to 8 p.m., we'll have our live Q&A. So at that time, if you have any personal questions or some questions you haven't finished yet, feel free to just chime in and ask your own questions. So our speakers, which are Gopika, Juan, and Peter, would you guys just maybe unmute yourself and kind of like introduce, do like a quick self-introduction? I mean, Gopika, maybe you can start first if you want.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm Gopika. I am a second-year medical student currently at the Medical College of Wisconsin. The way our curriculum works, you do M1, M2, and then go off into your PhD for 3 to 4 years, and then you come back for your M3 and M4. For my PhD, I will be joining a cardiovascular physiology lab, and I have an interest in surgery. So I'll be working on translational research with surgical samples. So really excited for that. Nationality, I'm an Indian citizen and I'm here on an F1 visa. I used to be on an H4 visa. So I've lived here since I was in middle school. So if you want to talk about that transition at some point too, would be happy to do so. Undergrad, I went to University of Wisconsin-Madison and I studied biomedical engineering, and I did not take any gap years.
Next one is Juan. Go ahead.
Yeah, so my name is Juan. I am, I guess, a G2 already. So I'm a fourth year MD PhD student, halfway through almost. So I've been through the medical school route and the grad school route. And we can talk about Vanderbilt specifically, but we do clerkships in the M2 year. So I've done a year of clerkships already. I'm doing my lab in, I'm doing my PhD in biomedical engineering, working on new treatments, new therapeutics for osteoarthritis. Nationality, I am Argentinian, but I'm a Canadian citizen, and I actually did my undergrad in Canada, so I might not be able to answer some of the questions regarding doing undergrad in the United States as an international school, University of Alberta in Canada. My major was actually biochemistry, and now I'm doing biomedical engineering, and I did not take any gap years between undergrad and med school.
Great. Next one is Peter.
Hi, everyone. My name is Peter. I'm currently in M1, and my interest is in genomics and computational biology. So my intended program in the future is probably in that field. Nationality-wise, I am from Shanghai, China, so I'm a Chinese citizen. And I went to Emory for undergrad in Georgia, and I studied computer science and biology. And after I graduated college, I did 2 years of gap years in New York City, and I did cancer genomics research for 2 years. So I'll be happy to talk about that experience navigating OPT, finding gap year jobs as an international student in the future. So yeah, happy to meet everyone today.
Great, thank you all. And so I'm Kevin, as you can see on my name. So I will be the host today, and Julieta, who is also here, she'll be moderating the chat. So if you have any questions during the discussion or anything you want to raise up, just feel free to type in the chat. And when it's the live Q&A session, you can start to like unmute yourself and ask questions. So we're just going to jump right into the questions. So the first thing is like, why do you guys choose MD PhD? The first question is, what is your understanding of MD PhD or MSTP program? Maybe also talk about the difference between these two and how is it different from either MD or PhD path, and why do you choose this path over the other two? Like MD or PhD. If you guys are ready, just feel free to unmute yourself and go.
Yeah, I can go first. So yeah, I think personally I can speak to this because at the time of application, I did apply for every type of program. So MD, PhD, MD, and then PhD. So I would admit that like I do have a kind of semi like diverse intention. But you know, like MD, PhD, it's exactly what it sounds like, you know, physician scientist. So like to me, I think it's definitely like a seamless like integration between medicine and science. And I think that's really important. And to be honest, like when I was applying, you know, MD and PhD, like having more backup options. But I think in terms of like differences, I think there's definitely like for international students, it's definitely important that you figure out what is your best fit because all of these paths are difficult. And it's not necessarily like one is more necessarily more difficult than the other one. But I always tell my mentees that like the important thing is figure out like what your interest is and what your kind of resume is best fit for, because like someone can be a good MD PhD applicant, but might not be as good of an MD or a PhD applicant. So I think figuring out your passion and really taking initiative to make yourself be the best applicant and MD PhD student is very important. So.
Yeah, I would say, I think Peter said it like really well there, but I applied to, I guess we have another question, but I applied to both MD and MD PhD programs. And a lot of the MD PhD programs, you can also say, let's say if they don't find you a good fit for the MD PhD program, they can still find you a good fit for the MD program as well. And you can get entrance through that way. Or the other option is maybe you decide I want to be a clinician, and then during medical school year, maybe the first 2 years, it is possible to switch from an MD program into an MD PhD program in certain universities and cases. So I think like Peter said, these paths are difficult to navigate, but as you go through undergrad, maybe doing research or shadowing clinician, you'll know which pathway might be better for you. If you can't decide or you like both, then the MD PhD route's probably the right one. If you're okay with doing 8 years of school, at least.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Peter and Juan have said. And the only thing I would add is look at the type of job prospects you're looking at. So what do you want to spend your career doing? A lot of MD PhDs usually somewhere fall in the split of doing 50 to 75% research or some less than that, and also have a clinical practice. Versus MDs, for the most part, are clinically oriented for almost 100% of their effort, but also do some clinical research. So they usually are not the ones running a lab. There are exceptions, but that's not, I guess, what the training is necessarily for. And then for a PhD, you're not really seeing patients. So I guess it ultimately comes down to what you want to spend your career doing, and accordingly pick your training path as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. Definitely, Gopika. And I think in terms of to give you guys more context, what led to my decision of choosing MD PhD. So basically, like when I was doing research in college, I think a big part of my interest in research is doing like really translational work, and like being able to see the application in clinic is really important to me. For example, like one of the projects that I worked on is using genomics to inform the clinical treatment or identify possible treatment mechanisms that we can target in sarcomas. And I think that's like an example of like what kind of project a physician scientist can do, because combining your knowledge in basic science, but also in clinical care and identifying where the clinical needs are, and then using your ability to address those issues, I think really the combination of that is what draws me to MD-PhD.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. So next question is, what is required to be a successful candidate for MD-PhD program? And is it harder or more competitive to get into MD-PhD programs than it is just for MD alone?
I guess the basic checklist for an MD PhD program, maybe I'll answer from the standpoint of how it's potentially different from just an MD candidate, right? So for an MD candidate, they look to make sure that you are going into medicine for all the right reasons. You've truly explored the field position of why you want to go into medicine. Like everyone else has alluded to, it is a hard and long path. So you want to make sure you're passionate about it. If you're passionate about it, it doesn't feel long and hard. But in addition to that, MD PhD programs want to make sure you've selected research as a serious component of your career and that you have some meaningful research experiences. So I think the difference there is, you could work in the lab as a lab tech, but have you gotten the opportunity to understand how they come up with a project? Have you gotten to understand what the scientific thinking and the process of moving a project forward looks like? Have you really experienced that? And do you think you could realistically do that and be happy in your career? So they want to make sure that you convey experiences that show that you can do that.
Yeah, that's probably the most important thing you'll get asked on in interviews. Like, what was your project? Some people might ask you what kind of experiments you did. So I think knowing your research project or what you've been doing in lab and why you're doing it in lab is super important. When you talk about competitiveness, if you're looking at it more from like a stats, like a GPA and MCAT standpoint, I think it's very dependent on the program specifically. But I'd like to think that MD PhD programs probably, since there's less applicants, they look at applications a little bit more thoroughly or holistically. And your person, and you also have a lot more interviews throughout the day. So I think your personality has a lot more opportunity to shine in an MD PhD interview versus, some of these MD programs get like 5,000 applications, and it's very hard to kind of keep track of what everyone did and why they deserve to get into that program. So I think if you think you have good personality skills and you're good at interviews and you can talk about why you did certain things, I think MD PhD programs would be a better fit in that scenario.
Yeah, and the last thing I would add, maybe specifically for international student, I think what makes MD PhD a competitive path, particularly for international students, is that you need to find programs that have the funding for you. So programs that are completely funded by the NIH only might not have funding for an international student. So when it comes time for applying, you want to make sure that you really look into their website to make sure that that program for that year has the funding. So even if a program does have international students and that funding didn't continue, they might not be able to take people on further. So if they don't have it explicitly stated on the website, MD PhD programs are small enough and they have enough bandwidth to answer your questions. So email them, call them, ask them. So before you submit your application, make sure that program can take you.
Yeah, I resound with like all of what Juan Gopika said. I think research is really important, and being able to talk about your research from kind of a bird's eye view all the way to, the most minute points of your research projects is really important, because I think that's what the interviewers are going to be focusing on a lot of the times. And there is really, really heavy focus in my experience in your research stuff. Not that the other part don't matter, but your research is definitely like on the forefront in what they care about the most. And also, I would also like really emphasize Juan's point that I would say MD PhD programs are a very holistic review process. So if you're worried that like, oh, my GPA and my MCAT isn't that high, I will tell you that like my stats are like the bottom 25% of my program. But I think like they did really focus on, the research side of things. And so I think there's definitely like, you can definitely make up for certain things with research or with other things in your resume.
Thanks for the great explanations. So our next theme is actually about when you're trying to apply for MD PhD programs. So the first question is really related to what Peter just said about research. So I heard research the most important component, no S, sorry, for being a strong applicant for MD PhD programs. Based on our experience, how much or what type of research is considered good? Do you mean to have publications, or are publications highly recommended to have?
I'd be happy to start again. What I did not have any publications when I applied. I had submitted publications, I had things in review, but at the time of my application, I didn't have anything fully published, and I did not think that it affected me too much. That being said, I think if I had waited a year and applied, and having the publications already submitted, I might have been more competitive for some of the bigger top programs. So take that with a grain of salt. But I wouldn't say publications are required for you to go into an MD PhD program. And for the type of research, it's kind of what we alluded to beforehand about really knowing your research from the standpoint of why you do what you do and how you would take it forward, and really thinking about it from a scientific standpoint. So not just so it's the type of research where you're not just carrying out experiments that someone else comes up with blindly, but rather really having a true understanding of what you're doing and being able to intellectually contribute to questions like, hey, if you had to take this research project forward, what would you do next? And you want to have a good understanding and be able to answer questions like that at these interviews. So it's not really like a particular type of research, but rather your involvement with the research that I would say matters.
Yeah, just going off of that, I think one way to show that like you understand your research is like, for example, in your personal statement, you can talk about how this informs your decision to pursue a physician scientist route, or you can talk about, maybe this is the type of things that I want to do in the future, or in your interview, when you talk about career goals, you can talk about how this inspires your interest in certain areas, and this is kind of what helps you define your own career goals. So I think, yeah, I think this generally goes into like more application and interview skills, but in general, I always tell people to like basically show, not tell, and give specific examples, and that's really important. And going back to this question, like just for exposure, I did have publication, but I would definitely say that this is not required to have, because I know that people in my program definitely like, I think probably half and half had publication and did not. So it's definitely not a requirement. That being said, it does, like Opika said, definitely help you positively, but then again, it's not a requirement. So don't let that deter you from putting in your MCAS application.
Yeah, and then exact same thoughts like always, but the other thing is they're very receptive to like updates throughout the interview cycle. So I was like Gopika, and I had an article submitted, and then throughout the application cycle, it finally got accepted, and then you can update them like, oh, it got accepted. Whether that actually made a difference or not, who knows? I have no idea, but they're always amenable to that. The other thing is, any type of kind of presentation, so a poster presentation, oral presentation, you can even put like a lab, like if you presented at your lab meeting, your data, or if you presented any sort of research data that you can talk about, can also go in as like a research experience inside AMCAS. And I think we can talk about that later, but I did everything last minute, last second, because I was a Canadian and I decided to apply to US MD PhD schools like very last second, but you should definitely look at the AMCAS, like a sample of an AMCAS, to see like how much we can fit in there, how much you can fit in there, and start thinking of how you would actually fit things that you've done in kind of an organized manner that shows them who you are as a person and as a researcher, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and it gets to kind of the nitty-gritty details of like, you have 15 items. Do you put a publication as a item, or do you put that as part of your research program? It kind of varies by situation, and like I think we're all accessible on F1 Mentors, F1 Docs. So like feel free to reach out to us when you have like a specific situations. And going back to like what's considered good, I've also it reminds me of like some people asking me about my opinion on like clinical research for MD PhD. I think that's like an important point that we need to clarify. I think unless you're going into a PhD for clinical research, which I've seen off and on, like some at some places, but mostly I would suggest that if you want to go into MD PhD, it's generally like basic science, or if you want to do social medicine or more humanities, that's like a separate discussion. But generally, you would want to probably go into basic science research or translational research, but not like clinical research.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. So the next question is it advisable to apply to MD-only programs to some schools because of the added risk of being international, combined with the increased competition of MD PhD programs? So I think that kind of echo back to what Gopika said about the NIH funding for some programs that you can really apply to.
Sorry. So I did apply to both MD and MD PhD programs. But as you go through the interview cycle, you will see the difference in the way they interview you, the things they care about in an MD interview versus an MD PhD interview, and what they really look for. And I think right at the beginning of the interview cycle, having seen both, I realized I fit in better with an MD PhD program, and I needed that PhD component to be happy. So I actually had applied for a master's program as a backup instead, and wasn't going to go to any MD programs only. So I was either MD PhD that year or do a master's for a year and then come back and try again the next application cycle. But originally when I applied, like you said, I did want that backup just in case MD PhD didn't work out. So it's not a bad idea.
Yeah, so I did the same, but you really have to think about it as, do you have the funds or the ability to take a loan, and are you willing to do that for 4 years? Because I think a lot of the times people are excited, like, oh, it's med school, like, gotta apply, gotta get it in, but it's like really down the line, you gotta think about certain things like that. And there's actually, there's a resource. Wow, see, I'm old, so I don't know what it's called anymore. But there's a resource, or there was an Excel sheet that says which international schools do accept MD PhD students, like Gopika said. Obviously, the 3 that we're at do accept international students. So I would highly suggest applying to Vanderbilt, because we usually have 1 or 2 actually every single year of international students. And it's usually actually the big programs, because they might have funding, like private source funding, because we can't be on NIH grants. And I don't want to get into specifics on that, but you should really do the research ahead of time, because if not, you have to write primaries and secondaries and you have to pay them money. And if they're not going to look at your application, then it was kind of a waste of your time and money when you could have, sent it to another program that does accept international students. And to get into those finer details, it might be better, like if you go on F1 Doctors, there's a lot of us on there, and you can email us and we can send you the links for those schools that do accept international students.
Student Doctor Network usually has like a forum on that where they keep updating that spreadsheet as well. I haven't looked at that in the last couple of years, like you said, so I don't know how up to date it is. But look at that spreadsheet and then do your own research. Because when I applied, I based it off of that spreadsheet. And even from those, a couple schools had changed their policy just for that year. So double check every school you apply to.
Sorry, the screen sharing just kind of blocking the last question for me. So if you're comfortable with the sharing, what other activities have you done? Oops, what is it? During your undergraduate, and how are they related to your MD PhD path?
Even though I applied last cycle, I had to kind of think about what I did in my undergrad. Yeah, so I think my main time commitment in college, aside from doing research stuff, is doing I was part of the EMS service on campus. So I went to college at Emory, and our EMS service is what was called Emory EMS, and I probably spent like 1,000 hours there, just doing shifts and stuff. And I think it was really great because I think I did have a lot of research experience, but also combining that with clinical side of things, and being able to show that I do have dedication toward the clinical care of patients. I think that's really important, and it's not like I want to do PhD first, so MD second. I'm kind of like showing that I want to do both, really do both together.
Yeah, I actually decided on MD PhD a little bit later in my undergraduate years. When I first started, I was pretty set on becoming a product design engineer, and being a biomedical engineer. So a lot of my undergraduate experiences, I worked at the makerspace. I started an inventors club. I did a lot of design work. So I did a lot more engineering and creative, entrepreneurial related activities beginning, and then switched into actually kind of happened upon my amazing PI, who is an MD PhD himself, started working in his lab. And that's when I really started deciding on what career path suits me best. And that's when I found MD PhD, shadowed quite a bit, and also volunteered at the hospital at UW-Madison. So I think I kind of switched from engineering, and my experiences kind of swayed towards medicine towards my graduating years. But my application was definitely different in the sense that I highlighted a lot of my engineering side of things and how I wanted to bring innovation into medicine. I also did a bit of teaching and tutoring, things like that too.
So this is actually super important. So I think one thing that, in undergrad, you're busy studying, doing all this stuff, but like keep doing things that make you happy, like your hobbies. And this is actually a thing for MD PhD programs as well, since it's like 7 to 8 years, you got to do stuff that keeps you happy and refreshes your mind. So I was, if you're a sport player, or I don't know if you like art, keep on doing that. I played soccer for all my life, and I continue to play during undergrad, and I think it gave me a lot of things to talk about, personal experiences. And I also coached a soccer team, so that's an easy way to, if you're an artist, maybe you can reach out to a program or community and teach other people how to draw or mentor, the younger individuals or something like that. So I think that came up a lot in my interviews. If it's something you've done for years and you can really talk about it, it shows a lot in your interview. The other thing is, I think like everyone else said, I did some volunteer in the ER department, and that gave me a lot of things to talk about as well. I think if you go to most hospitals, they'll have some kind of clinical volunteering opportunities if you're trying to find a doctor. I also shadowed a family physician in my community, which I think was important in my talk as well. I'm trying to think, this was like 2017, a while ago. Yeah, that's the most of it. I think I have more. I just can't remember right now.
Yeah, while you think on, I think I want to reiterate that like having stuff outside of just medicine research is so important. And I think like outside of research and medicine, what the admission committee really want to see is that you are like a real person and you have hobbies and you have interests outside of school and your career, because in the long run, it's a marathon and you can't just survive on doing work all the time. So if you have interests, like I would definitely encourage you to pursue those. And whether or not it relates back to medicine is kind of a different discussion. I think it's more or less like just good for your own psyche once you're like in med school and you need to blow off some steam, and your hobbies and your interests is what keeps you through. Yeah, and I've heard like from several mentees that like maybe like they have some other interests that coincidentally lead them back to the medicine and PhD path. And when that happens, it's like serendipitous, and it's great that like you are coming from a place that's really genuine and it's really authentic. And I think it really will show in your application too.
Yeah, I would 100% echo that. And I guess I answered as a medicine related things, but I think the part that I talked most about in my application was the work that I did with promoting K-12 education in the Milwaukee School District with United Way. And that was something that I've always been passionate about. I started that in high school. So anytime over the summers when I came back to Milwaukee from Madison, I stayed involved with that work. And you can really carry that forward even in medical school. So even now I'm involved with quite a few of our pipeline programs at MCW that promotes undergraduate students, middle school students, high school students, and really exposing them to different careers in medicine and other outreach opportunities where it's not just medicine related, right? So there's other ways to give back to the community that if you're passionate about, you really should. And the same way, I always grew up loving dance. So I joined a whole bunch of different dance clubs in Madison. And now we have something called like Variety Fest, which is basically a talent show. And every year a bunch of us put together like a cool Bollywood dance for it. So there's so much things that if you're really excited about, you should do and you should talk about in your application and you should talk about in your interviews. And I think that will make you stand out more than the cookie cutter experiences for sure.
Great, thanks for sharing. So our next theme is really about like who we are as F1 visa holders and international students. So as international students, how is your application viewed differently compared to a domestic student? And do you need to do anything extra to get in?
I mean, yeah, there's no like sugarcoating it. Like, I think it is definitely going to be a little more difficult as an international student. So I wouldn't say like you have to like do extra on like everything, but definitely just do the best you can, and that's really all you can do, right? So that would be the only advice. Like, I think when I was an applicant, I was just thinking like, oh my God, like my domestic student friend has this, and that, and like, oh, I need to like be better than that. But at the end of the day, just like do your best, and that's all that matters.
I would also add that maybe we're not the most quote unquote qualified to answer that. I don't know if any of us are truly into like, I don't know if you get to do that, Juan, because you're further along in your training, but we don't truly have an in with regards to how that decision is made. That being said, it might feel like your application is viewed differently, especially at programs where they might not have that funding component. So if the funding definitely makes you a little different kind of an applicant, and they do need to take that into consideration. But I think if a program has funding, you should be a-okay. At least that's been my experience, I would say. I don't know if you have further to add to that.
Yeah, like we get to do a little bit of like interviewing applicants, and I mean it actually like never, at Vanderbilt at least, it's all going to be institution specific, but at Vanderbilt at least it never really comes up. It more comes up as, you know, we look at the application and say, is this someone we want, and would they be a good fit in our program? The interview is very important because you spend 2 days with students that kind of host you and drive you around. And when you're at a program for 8 years, it's almost like, I don't want to get too far down the line, but when people are taking like residency programs, they really think, can I see myself working or being peers with this person for 7 to 8 years? So I think that's really important. As far as Peter said, it's gonna be harder, but if you apply to these schools that have this maybe an excess source of funding or very well funded, ones that come to mind to me are like WashU and St. Louis. I know a few international students, like a handful of international students I got in there. Vanderbilt here, those schools will probably compare you like a domestic student because they have the funds to do so. So I would say, Peter, just try your best, be confident in yourself, and know why you want to do it, and know that you deserve it in the end.
Yeah, and I think it was mentioned before the session, like a lot of these policies are institution specific. Like I've interviewed at, I think it was Emory, that like would waitlist all the international students no matter like how well you did in the first round, and then only start taking international students after they interview all the applicants. So like a lot of these things, like you might feel like there's just so much uncertainty in this. And I know like this is definitely like, it feels like a cop-out answer. But like, I think just for your own sanity, like just do the best you can. And I think at the end it will work out.
Great, thanks for sharing. So the next question is, what was your process of making a school list, and any tips for us to are about to apply?
So yeah, there should be an Excel file or something in like Student Doctor. I mean, I don't want to like make you guys to go to Student Doctor Network, because we all know that that can be a little bit stressful seeing stuff on there a lot of the times. But if you search like international MD PhD students, I think there's threads by year of international students, at least when I was applying. And then there should be, what's it called? It was like MSAR something. There's something that MCAS releases, and it'll say if they accept international students as well. And then I think Gopika said a lot of these MD PhD programs are very willing to get back to you. So instead of just like picking them on MCAS and then sending them money and then doing a primary, just like you can maybe like formulate an email, maybe a little bit different, copy and paste, and ask them to make, if you want to make double sure, do you accept, hey, I'm interested in your program, I'm an international student, do you guys accept, or have you accepted international students in the past? You can also, a lot of them have MD PhD student profiles as well. So if you go on their clinic, and some of them might say where they might be from, like nationality wise or international student. And you can do it off that way as well. But I definitely go on Student Doctor Network and get access to that Excel sheet that'll tell you which schools do accept international students. And mostly you can, I don't know, if you call like the big name schools, like, I don't like using the word, but like Ivy League schools and these bigger, more well-funded institutions will usually accept international MD PhD students.
Yeah, and make sure you look at that list, because there are some not so big name schools that you'd be surprised have a significant amount of funding for you. So again, it's like you do need to do a little bit more research to figure out what schools are accepting international students this round. But I know like Medical University of South Carolina accepts international students, and they have good funding for that. MCW has great funding for that. I can't think of a lot of other schools off the top of my head, but look at that list.
Yeah, Student Doctor Network is good. Personally, when I was applying, I was using NSAR a lot because they do have one column that has MD PhD stats on it. And I think out of all the stats out there, probably NSAR is the most reliable. But also with the caveat that, like, you know, policies change, and I always like pretty much double check on the official website. They usually have it, but you know, when they don't, again, feel free to, I think, reach out to them. They're usually pretty receptive to inquiries about those things. Yeah, in terms of like, I think international friendly schools, I think Vanderbilt, WashU, MCW, South Carolina, Emory was pretty good. And yeah, I mean, I by no means have a full list, but I think off the top of my head, like those schools do sound pretty international friendly. And I've known like probably a handful at like each school that are international students.
The other thing that you also want to consider is MSTP versus MD PhD programs. So there are a lot more programs that are MD PhD but don't have that MSTP designation that do take international students. And I actually didn't realize this until after I've already been accepted at places. Some of the non-MSTP programs don't give you the same level of funding that an MSTP program can give you. So you might only get, you know, a tuition waiver and maybe a stipend during your 4 years of PhD, but you might need to figure out your own living expenses for the other 4 years of medical school. So that's a distinction between the level of funding that an MD PhD program without MSTP designation might be able to provide. So make sure you look into that as well.
Great. So our next topic is just some miscellaneous questions. So the first question is just, do you have any hidden tips or strategies that could boost one's chance of getting accepted to medical school? Considering if got accepted, retrospectively, what do you think that made you stand out from the rest of the applicants? I got this one just really application focused.
Yeah, I'd go first. I think it wouldn't be like a hidden tip or strategy, but I think, you know, I've talked to some prospective applicants, and you know, and not everyone's perfect, right? Like we all have our like drawbacks and stuff. So like I would say probably my advice is to like remember that this admission process is holistic. And you know, for me, like I think my GPA and my MCAT wasn't like top tier, And I like tried to make up for that with other aspects of my application, right? So my advice is that like make yourself whole, make sure that you remember it's a holistic process. And if you have, not perfect certain aspects, you can more than make up for with other areas on your resume. And I think in terms of the second part of the question, I think what made me stand out from applicants is probably my research. I think I did have 4 to 5 publications at the time of application. And that's because, I took 2 gap years. So I think that's what helped me stand out. And then again, like going back to the whole holistic process, I think, my research kind of made up for my weaknesses on the other parts.
Yeah. Any other thoughts?
I'd say the same thing. There's really no hidden tips or strategies. A lot of the things are laid out in SDN, but when you're making your application, I guess you got to think strategically of how to make yourself most representative of who you are without making yourself seem like someone you're not, or like a lot of the other medical school applicants. Most people will have clinical experience. Most people will have research, but really, so just stating that you did research or just stating, oh, I shadowed a doctor, I saw patients, is probably not going to be good enough. Find out why that opportunity was important for you, how you grew from it, what you learned from it, and why that's going to make you a good MD PhD student and a good physician scientist in the future. And being able to word that in a way that comes off as genuine is like super important. So I would definitely start looking at the AMCAS early on. Maybe getting us at F1 Doctors to maybe read some of the stuff you write before you click that nervous submit button. And I think that's how I stood out from the rest of the applicants.
Yeah, and lastly, I would say make sure you have people in your corner that can give you, constructive negative feedback if something in your application really is not well written or something is not good. Make sure you have people that will be honest with you about that are reading your application and helping you edit that. I had wonderful mentors who were willing to do that, and that's an important part of making sure that your application really conveys what you're trying to. So make sure a lot of people read it. And I guess I don't know if it's a hidden tip strategy, but if you have good mentors or people you are close to, having a recommendation letter from them that's really personable and strong, I think helps hugely. So if you have professors and people you can get great recommendation letters from, that will definitely help you as well. And I think what helped me most was actually the interview day. I think once you get your foot in the door, make sure you really prepare. And for every interview, like Juan mentioned before, you have 2 days of activities and things going on. I made sure I researched every professor I was interviewing with or just talking to. So they have people that are not interviewers, but they're rather just like, you're just having a conversation with them to get to know the program more. So some of them are official interviews, some of them are just conversations, but those conversations affect you. If they say, hey, I really like this person, it still matters, right? So I made sure I looked up every single person on my schedule. Understood what they were working on. So when I went into my interview day, I knew exactly what I was expecting. I knew I could talk reasonably, not super intelligent, but reasonably about their research and things that excited them. So it shows that you care about the program and you made an effort. So I think that probably was what made me stand out.
Yeah, I think I just want to touch on one more point, kind of going along with what Juan was saying. And I think this generally goes for like whatever kind of application you're going for. Framing your narrative is really important. Kind of your story of how you get from where you came from to here, applying to medical school, why you want to be here. I think showing that you are genuine in your pursuits is what helps you get your foot through the door. So.
Right, and be honest with your goals. So when I was applying, I wrote in my application about my involvement with past product design stuff and how that's still very relevant and important in my life. And I continue to stay involved with design challenges and things like that in medical school. So if something like that is important to you, write about it and be honest with your story, be honest about who you are as a person and what you want to do with medicine. And programs that will value you and interview you will also make sure that they can support your goals and passions as well. So just be honest in your application about who you are and what you want to do in medicine.
Thank you for sharing. And this will be our last pre-recorded question. So how would I know if I should take gap year or not? And do you have any recommendations for what to do with gap years? Will our application be considered in context? For example, like we won't be expected to have as many research hours as someone who took a gap year. I mean, I hope the question makes sense for you guys. And if it doesn't, like, let me know if there's like any need for clarification.
I go first since I'm the only person who took gap years in this group. But I would say like it's definitely is situation dependent. Me personally, I wanted to have more research experience to make sure that I put my best foot forward. Not that you need to. Again, it's situation dependent. It depends on really what you want. And I think if you want to, do more research and have more stuff on your resume, which is what I wanted to do, then I think you should take gap years. I've also had like people ask like, oh, what should I do in my gap year, right? Some people might be like, they did a lot of research in undergrad and they are like pretty much set on that front, but they have no clinical experience, right? Even though it's MD PhD, like you still want some level of clinical exposure, right? At the end of the day, it's still MD plus PhD. So like in those scenarios, I would say like, oh, maybe looking into maybe part-time working in a lab and, volunteering in the hospital, other times. Or you can figure out like really the best situation for yourself. Like, again, like framing your narrative, right? Like think about what are your goals, what are your interests, and how you can best present yourself in your application. And this is really valuable time. So you're in your 20s, like you don't want to be like just wasting your gap years doing like some random things. So yeah, so like I think about what you want, think about what your goals are, think about what you can do to get yourself there. I think that determines what you want to do. There's no like cookie cutter solution like, oh, you want to be an MD PhD, you have to do research for your gap years. We're running out of time, so I'll let the other two panelists also chime in on this too.
I would say just go with your gut. If you know you're ready, or if you think you're ready, or you're ready, you'll be ready. If you don't, you really don't want to rush and make a poor application. I mean, I'm putting quotation marks, a poor application, because it's a lot of money. It's a lot of time sitting there writing about stuff. So if you think those experiences, you're going to like those experiences and you wouldn't mind taking a year or two, which, I mean, half of my class took gap years. And if you look at most of the top schools, I would say probably half MD PhD students are probably take some sort of a gap year or two. Then patience is a virtue, right? So like you'll be ready, you'll know when you're ready. And then about the application being viewed in context, I think, yes, it will. If you apply straight out of undergrad, they might not expect as much research. Like, if you did summers, if you did 1 or 2 summers, maybe a year, that'll be enough as an undergrad research-wise.
Any other things to add on?
Yeah, I think there's no exact science to it. It's just a feel. When you feel ready to apply, do it. I ask myself the same thing. If I could go back in time, would I have taken a gap year to make sure I had all my publications accepted before I had applied? On some days, I'm like, yeah, absolutely. On other days, I'm like, well, I absolutely love my program and I'm already in it. So why would I have taken another year when I could start what I want to do earlier? So it's up to you. When you feel ready, go for it. And also ask mentors. If you have MD PhDs for already, established clinicians and physician scientists in your area that can mentor you, please reach out and ask them. Ask them to look at your application and say, can you give this a critical eye? Do you think I'm ready? And ask a couple people. Just because one person says no doesn't mean you're a bad applicant. Ask a couple people, get some feedback. And then at the end of the day, it's about, your gut feeling too.
Great. Thank you all for sharing. So we are officially done with our pre-recorded questions and we're going to our live Q&A sections. So I do know we're a little bit running out of time. So if you guys are all okay, we're just gonna save like 20 minutes to do like a live Q&A. Okay, thank you so much. So for our audience, feel free to raise your hand if you want to ask questions or type in the chat. Yes, you can private message to Grace or Julieta, or you can ask the questions just by unmute yourself. I think if people are waiting for the chat, I'm just gonna ask a question for myself actually, because I do have a question. Like for you guys, like how long of research have you done? I know Peter did like 2 gap years, which is like a significant like longer period of time. But for Gopika and for Juan, how long have you done research like during undergraduate years?
I got into research from almost my first semester at undergrad. So I've all 4 years. Granted, they were not all in medical though. So I did some engineering based research before I switched into medical research.
Good question. Yeah. So I started the summer after my second year. So I had summer between second and third year research, and then I did a summer internship the next summer. So I only had like a year or a year and a half before applying. So that tells you that if you can explain why you did it and why you chose certain things, it's still possible.
Thanks for sharing. So any other questions?
Yes, I got a question from the chat. Someone was asking about how should we prepare for the interviews, and especially the MD and PhD interviews, and could you give us some insights about that? Thank you.
Yeah, I can go first. So generally, I think MD PhD interviews are 2 days, and generally you would interview with the MD committee and also the MD PhD committee. At some schools, the MD PhD committee is set, and you can actually like look at the faculty and kind of pretty much figure out like who's going to interview you depending on your research area. But just because I know some programs like do try to match you up with like the MD PhD committee members in the same area, but definitely program dependent. But generally, what you can expect is about probably 4 to 6 interviews over the course of 2 days. And yeah, and the MD PhD committee are going to ask you more about your PhD side. So definitely I would advise before you go to the interview, just to like know your research projects in and out. Like, even if it's like you've, like me, taken gap years, and this is my second year of gap year, but I wrote something that's like, sophomore year of college. You still have to know that, just because, you put that there, that means like it's your experience. You've got to like be able to talk about it. And again, we've mentioned before, knowing the big picture of your project, why you're doing it, and how that kind of inform your career decision. And in terms of the MD side, it's going to be like more traditional. So, be ready to talk about your clinical experience, why you're interested in medicine, and why you want to be a doctor. And yeah, I think, also like why school, why program, it's very important. Generally for any interview, you want to know, like, for starters, what is the curriculum for the program? For MD PhD, it's more so important that like there are faculties you're interested in working with. Some schools I know that allow you to put in names that you can basically talk to as part of your interview process, not an evaluative process, but more just like for you to get to know faculty. And they ask you to put in potential faculty members, and you can talk to them too. So, and in terms of like not like strictly performance things, I think it's important for applicants to like, it is an interview for you, but it's also an interview for the school on your part, because you want to make sure that you will be happy for the next 8 years of your life in this program. So yeah, I've rambled on for too long. I'll let the others talk about it too.
No, that was all great advice. I would say do mock interviews, practice like the most basic questions you get, why medicine? Tell me about yourself. You would think like those are easy answers, but when that's like the first question they ask you and you're nervous, sometimes your brain's not thinking just yet. So have those, ready to go. Also, don't rehearse your answers too much. You want to be an authentic person they can have a conversation with. If you're just like saying the same paragraph that you've memorized for every answer, it's not as personable. They want to get to know you as a person, and they want to know that if you're at their institution, they can come by and talk to you, and you're going to be a pleasant, nice human being, right? So make sure you show that side of you as well. And I think the last component, in all of my interviews, at least, I think at least the night before was the latest, when I got my schedule of like, here's all the people you'll be interviewing with and at what time. Sometimes they give you the morning of, but at some point in time before your interview day starts, you will get a list of people who are interviewing you. So just do a little bit of research, get to know what's ahead in your day. And I think being prepared helps. Even if it doesn't come up or you talk nothing about them, it gives you like a sense of confidence too, because you're going in there with some sense of power that you know what's going on. But definitely would recommend those.
Yeah, last thing I'd add is just that a lot of programs are moving to the MMI interviews, the multi-mini interviews. And I'd say those are primarily more MD only schools. So, but if you're applying to both, I'd definitely like practice those with friends that might be applying. A lot of schools will have like career programs that will do a multiple mini interview with you. And a lot of them will also have regular interviews as well. I applied in Canada, and like every school does multiple mini interviews. So I read a book, like an ethics book. It's called Doing Right, which could help. It's about medical ethics. It's just, if you're interested in medicine in general, it's a good book to read.
Oh, and the last thing I would add, some schools, and I know MCW does this, have an MD PhD interview day, and then you go in with the rest of the MD group and you interview separately for the MD group. So at least I think this is the same how MCW works this year, but when I applied, you had to at least get accepted or waitlisted at the MD program separately, and then the MD PhD program can decide to let you in. So you have to impress both committees. So make sure you know how that process works. So you don't want to sit there in your MD interview and just ramble on and on about your research when they're looking for a clinician. So in the MD interview, when they ask you, you want to talk about your clinical experiences, versus in your MD PhD interview, go on, ramble about your research. So know what type of interview setting you're going into.
Yeah, two things that I thought of while y'all were talking. First thing is, I generally don't advise going on Student Doctor Network, but this is like a case where like SDN could be like helpful when it comes like very objective information of like what the interview will be like. You know, all the other like neurotic stuff I do not stand for, but you know, those kind of information you can readily find on SDN. And I generally don't change that much, although I don't know how COVID affect all of those things. But yeah, SDN will be a good resource to find out what's happening this year. Second thing is, when you are interviewing, try to make sure that it's a conversation, not just like a grilling of like your resume. Like when the interviewers ask you, tell me about your research, you answer that question and you turn it back to your the interviewer and be like, oh, so what do you do at this institution? And just like making a conversation. And generally like people love to talk about themselves. And when they talk about themselves, it makes them really happy. And you want the interviewers to be happy, right? So I think like, just remember that you're having a conversation and yeah, and just have like a free-flowing, pleasant conversation with the interviewer. Like don't worry too much about like, oh, like this guy is like here to like evaluate me, and just, you know, like have a conversation with your PI or with, you know, a postdoc in your lab. Talk about, you know, what they're interested in too.
Yeah, and assume you're, even though they're not going to, assume you're being not evaluated, but at least taken into consideration every minute that you spend with the program. So with MD, PhD interviews, a lot of times you have dinners, you have drinks, you have social events, and be social, be a good human being, be fun, but still be on your best front. And you know, they might not directly be the people interviewing you, but if you do something and you raise red flags, we are all required, like we're all supposed to speak up about it. So make sure you put your best foot forward during all of those.
I got a question from the chat. Someone asks, were you able to get accepted to multiple programs? Why did you choose the program you are currently attending?
For me, two reasons. I wanted the option to do a potential PhD in biomedical engineering. I hadn't decided if I wanted to do a biomedical engineering PhD or do a more basic science PhD. So I wanted to have that option at the institution I went to. And two, I'd actually committed elsewhere and then I switched over here because I absolutely loved the class of people that they'd selected, that I met during my second look day. And I was like, if I could spend the next 8 years with these people, I'd be happy. So I felt very at home, and I loved the people that were going to be in my class. So it felt great to be here.
For me, it was more based on the research I was interested in. For me, like I was really interested in genomics, computational biology, and my institution was like hands down, like probably the best in the nation. So in that area, so for me, it was like a pretty easy decision, just based on like the PhD part of the program.
I guess for me, a big one for Vanderbilt, well, something I really liked about Vanderbilt is that we do clerkships in the second year. And I felt like I still didn't know what kind of so clerkships is basically when you go on the different specialties of medicine, like family medicine, internal medicine, surgery, when you really get into the nitty gritty of the hospital and kind of try to understand what you may be interested in. And I think it was very useful and useful for a lot of my classmates because I don't know if Harvard and Wisconsin, they might have a program like this. I know Duke has one. Hopkins is also, I think, like a shortened preclinical year. And it really allowed me to understand that I like musculoskeletal research and biology. And I probably wouldn't have done I came in as a biochemist doing structural biology. And if I didn't have clerkships, I don't know what I'd be doing. And instead, I'm working in a biomedical engineering lab making new therapeutics for osteoarthritis treatments. So that's an important factor. Another important factor is location for me. So I was choosing between Vanderbilt and Northwestern were my last two decisions. And I just figured I like hiking, anything outdoors, and Vanderbilt and Nashville, Tennessee was perfect for that. Meanwhile, Northwestern's kind of in downtown Chicago. They still have, I also wanted to move away from the cold being a Canadian. So that was actually like an important factor for me too. It's 8 years of your life. Like a place could be amazing research wise, but if you're like, it's cold and you don't want to go to lab in the morning, like, I don't know, it's important things to consider that you don't really think about when you're looking at like research and medical reasons to go to a place.
Great, thanks for sharing. So we probably have like time for maybe one more questions. So I don't know if there's any question in the chat or.
Yeah, I got another question, and someone asked for this is question for Gopika. And since you said you were interested in surgery and research, so the student was wondering, is it possible for you to do both, or do you have to like focus on one of them? And yeah.
So definitely. And I think one of the greatest things about our program here is we have a lot of opportunities to meet different MD PhDs in their field, just to understand their career perspective. And I actually met a plastic surgeon who's a surgeon scientist. She runs her own lab and does pain-based research, tissue engineering, and things like that. So it's very possible. Granted, the split might look different, right? So if you want to be an excellent surgeon, there is a component of the more surgeries you do, the better you probably are, right? And your technical skills really matter in that sense. So surgeon scientists might not usually be the people that have the 75% lab, 25% clinic split, or 80, 80-20 or anything like that. They might be a little bit more 50-50 or more clinical and less time in the lab. Which I think I'm okay with. And there's always the option to collaborate with another research scientist or have a combined lab where you also have a full-time research scientist on board. So I would suggest, and I'm still in the process of doing it, so as I learn more, I'd be happy to share, but there's quite a few surgeons who have figured out a way to carve out enough research time that's meaningful and also bring in collaborators to make sure that their lab runs smoothly, that their students are well taken care of. And if you can find role models and mentors that are currently doing it, it helps hugely. But surgery is an amazing field, so do it.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I got a question. How do you frame your research essay if you aren't sure of the field you want to go to?
I don't think your research essay matters. Please say so if you think otherwise. A lot of so I had like 6-7 different labs that I'd gone through because I was still figuring out my way. I'm the first person in my family to study in America. So I was still like, oh, research is a thing. As a student, you can do research. So like I was still exploring every opportunity that came along. And as I figured out what I liked, I switched more into those opportunities. So I started out with like glaucoma research somewhere, doing some coding work. And then I was doing Internet of Things. And then I was doing biomechanics for a little bit. So I jumped a bunch of labs before I had my like 2 years in the same lab type of experience where I found what I truly liked and what I resonated with. And I wrote exactly that in my research essay. I said, I've always been the type of person that said, I like this, so I'll try it out. If I don't like it, I figure out what I do like, and then I do take that path. And I wrote about, here's the experiences that I had, and here's what I learned from them. And here's what maybe didn't work, and here's what I learned from that. So I think the best thing that you can do in your research essay is really write about what you took away from those experiences, what you learned, and how it's going to influence you as a scientist in the future, and as you move forward. I don't think they expect you to have your research field figured out when you write that. Peter might be different in that sense, but I definitely wasn't set on any particular field when I joined.
Yeah, and I think that's like totally, I totally agree with that. I think depending on like, the person who posed the question, depending on like where you are in your stage of undergrad, I think if you're earlier, definitely be more intentional about like, choosing a lab, think about what you're interested in, because like, those things is how you kind of frame your journey, your scientific journey, right? Like you think about, maybe it's like one specific aspect of your previous lab experience that inspire you to find something else, then you can definitely write about that in your kind of narrative. But if you are kind of ready to apply, then I would say like, think about why you chose those experiences in the first place. And then maybe you can say something along the lines of, in terms of your narrative, you can say like, oh, this is how I demonstrate, this is how like intellectually curious I am, right? I explore all these different aspects of scientific knowledge, and this is really interesting to me, and I still haven't figured it out, but I've done a lot of things in different areas, right? So yeah, I mean, those are just like, I think specific things that like, just think about like how you can frame it in a consistent way, depending on which stage of your training you're in. And yeah, like if again, plug for F1 Docs, like if y'all want like more hands-on one-on-one, situation-wise mentoring, like now we're giving you like very, very generalized advice, and we're all happy to like talk more about your specific resume, specific application, how you frame your own story. So.
I think we had time for like one last question. I know it's kind of going over time, but like maybe one last question. So Julietta, bring it up.
Yeah, so I got a new question. It says, what would you do? What would you do differently if you could relive your undergrad years?
Make up my mind sooner. But at the same time, I think it was fun exploring everything that I did. But honestly, probably nothing different. I'm a strong believer in everything that you did brought you to where you are. So do you really want to change anything?
Yeah, I mean, hindsight 2020, like it's hard for I think it's probably hard for us to say anything, because I mean, we're all in really good programs and we're all like finding our way. A lot of it is like finding your way and your interests through the process, to be honest. I didn't start research. I came in thinking, okay, I'm just going to go to do my biochem degree, and I want to be a family physician in rural Alberta, Canada. Look where I am now. I'm in Nashville, Tennessee, doing an MD PhD program. So like, it is what it is. Like, go through your life, try to find what drives you, what motivates you, what interests you, and try to be like the best version of yourself. And then I think you won't regret or change anything in the past.
Yeah, and I would say probably worry less and be on SDN less. But again, like I think very similar to Juan, like hindsight 2020, it's easy for us to say, worry less now. Don't worry, you're gonna get into a program. I know the specific point in time where I went from the worry, constantly anxious applicant to the person who's telling other applicants like, don't worry, you're gonna get into a program. And that's like the point where like I got my admission letter. But then again, I think it is true that like going on SDN all the time is not gonna help you get in. So and in terms of like other things, I'll probably like I think going back to like the point of holistic admissions, try to think about stuff that I could make up for, just like, make yourself more of a holistic person where you have like every single area covered. Yeah.
All right, great. That's all the question. Thank you so much for sharing all your great thoughts and acknowledgement. So as Peter said, FN Doctors is such a useful website. There are so many like international medical students and also residents and like attendings, even mentors out there. So they offer like a variety of different like kinds of helps. If you're interested in like, having them proofread your personal statement, like, you know, do some mock interviews, definitely check out the website. There are like so many useful resources that can be found on there. And so thank you everyone for attending. So we do have a feedback form here. I'm just gonna quickly share that in the chat. So please fill out the feedback form just to let us know how they did, how you liked the panel by filling it out. And for the future events, please follow our Instagram. So this is MedX International Instagram, and this is IPMS Instagram. So you can find them by just Google the names. And yeah, thank you everyone so much for attending. Hope you have a great night. And this is the end of our panel.